It was an unusually quiet Halloween evening. The streets, which were usually filled with the cheerful hustle and bustle of children in costumes, were almost deserted. Perhaps it was the weather. The sky was overcast, and an icy wind swept through the alleys. I had decided to spend the evening alone at home, watching a few horror movies and expecting the occasional trick or treat calls at the door. The first children came by as usual around 6 p.m. Small groups of witches, monsters, and ghosts excitedly went from house to collect candy. I opened the door for them, smiled, and gave them their treats. It was a pleasant routine that I enjoyed every year. However, around 9 p.m., things suddenly became strange. The streets grew quiet, and no one knocked on my door anymore. I thought maybe it was due to the cold and the children had gone home early, but something didn't feel right. It was one of those nights where you sense something is in the air, something eerie. I sat back down on the couch to continue watching my movie, but the silence in the house became increasingly oppressive. The wind howled louder outside, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Time and again, I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, but when I looked, no one was there. Just as I was about to calm down, the doorbell rang again, but this time it was different, a single, long ring that pierced the silence and made my heart beat faster. I got up, went to the door, and opened it carefully. 3 figures stood outside. They were wearing masks, but they were not ordinary Halloween masks. These were different, old, strangely detailed, as if handmade, and each one showed a grotesquely distorted face. It was hard to tell if they were meant to represent monsters or humans. The figures said nothing, no cheerful trick or treat, just silence. They simply stood there, staring at me through the terrifying masks. I held the basket of candy in my hand, unsure if I should give them any. Their behavior was unsettling, and I couldn't see their eyes behind the masks. Hesitantly, I held out the bowl of sweets to them, but they didn't move. A minute passed, and the tension grew. Finally, one of them reached for a candy, slowly and almost mechanically, as if the movement were rehearsed, but none of them spoke. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about them was wrong. I didn't know if it was the masks or the eerie silence that surrounded them, but I just wanted them to go away. But instead of leaving, they stayed put. They seemed to be waiting for something, I didn't know what. Uncertain, I slowly closed the door in front of them, but no sooner had I done so than I heard the doorbell ringing again, this time in an unnaturally fast rhythm. The ringing wouldn't stop. It was as if they were playing with the door, as if the noise was meant to wear me down. My heart pounded faster now, and panic began to spread in my chest. Who were these people? Why were they still standing there? I had given them their candy, yet they hadn't moved an inch. Reluctantly, I went back to the door. This time, I looked through the peephole. They were still there, motionless, like statues being pushed back and forth by the wind. Their masks looked even more terrifying from this perspective. I couldn't see their faces, but the empty, disturbing stare behind the masks was driving me crazy. I considered calling the police, but the thought seemed excessive. It was just children, or maybe they just wanted to scare me. But the longer I looked through the peephole, the more I felt I was making a mistake. These children were too quiet, too unnatural in their movements. I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack. "Can you please leave?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice trembled. No answer. They just stood there, the wind playing with the shreds of their costumes, but they themselves didn't move an inch. As I was about to close the door again, I suddenly felt something heavy press against it. One of them was holding the door fast. Panicked, I took a step back as the door slowly opened wider. The one holding it was now fully visible. It was one of the masked figures, and the hand pushing the door open was strangely large and heavy, as if it didn't belong to a normal person. The other 2 stood motionless in the background, watching me. My throat was dry, and I couldn't form a clear thought. I stepped further back, and the figure entered my house. He was tall, much taller than I had assumed from a distance. The mask covering his face showed a grotesque smile that made me even more uneasy. It was a smile that seemed neither friendly nor human. I finally managed to speak. "What do you want?" I asked, but the words sounded weak and fearful even to my own ears. No answer. The masked figure moved slowly toward me, his movement unnatural, as if his joints were incorrectly assembled. The other two were still standing outside, as if keeping watch. My thoughts raced. Should I run away, call the police? But I couldn't move. It was as if the presence of these figures held me fast, as if their mere existence drained the strength from me. The room seemed to fill with an oppressive darkness, even though the lights were still on. Then, without warning, the masked figure abruptly turned around and left the house as if nothing had happened. But I felt that this was only the beginning. After they left, I felt like I was in a nightmare. Minutes passed, but I could barely move. The door was open. The wind blew coldly through the hallway, but I felt paralyzed. The masks, the silence, the way they moved, none of it made sense. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a stupid prank, but as I finally closed the door and sat on the couch, time seemed to blur. Something was different. The world around me felt distorted, as if something had changed, as if I had slipped into another reality. The night passed slowly and I couldn't sleep. Again and again, I heard the faint echo of the doorbell in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their masks, those eerie faces staring at me as if they wanted to tell me something. But what was it? What did all this mean? Around 3 a.m., I decided to go outside to get some fresh air. Maybe it would help clear my head. But as I walked down the street, I noticed that all the houses were dark. No Halloween decorations, no lights, nothing. It was as if the whole street had been abandoned. I sensed that something was wrong. The nightmare had only just begun. As I walked down the street, I realized it was unnaturally quiet. No cars, no people, no signs of life. It was as if the whole city had fallen into a deep sleep while I was the only one still awake. The Halloween decorations that had been visible everywhere earlier in the evening were gone. The houses, usually adorned with lights, stood dark and deserted. Not a single pumpkin, not a flickering light, nothing indicated anymore that it was Halloween. My breath quickened, and I began to wonder if I was hallucinating. How could everything have changed so quickly? I wanted to go back into the house, but something inside me stopped me. An inner instinct told me there was no point in retreating. Something terrible was going on, and I had to find out what it was. My gaze wandered down the street until I saw something unusual at the end of the road. A single street lamp flickering in the dark, and underneath it stood something. It was hard to make out, but the outlines were clear. It was one of the masks from the figures of the night. They stood there motionless as if waiting for me. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood frozen in place. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my feet moved almost on their own. Slowly, I approached the lamp at the end of the street. The closer I got, the clearer the figure became. It was one of the masked figures from before, the same grotesque mask, the same eerie silence. But this time he was alone. The other two seemed to have disappeared. My heartbeat accelerated. I wanted to turn back, wanted to run back into my house and lock myself in, but something about this figure held me captive. It was as if it wasn't just watching me, but drawing me toward it like an invisible force. Its mask glowed faintly in the flickering of the street lamp, and the grotesque smile seemed to mock me. I stopped a few meters in front of the figure and looked at it. It didn't move, no movement, no sound. The wind blew through the trees, but the masked figure remained still as a statue, firmly rooted to the ground. My breath was shallow, and I couldn't bring myself to say anything. It was as if I were being dragged into a nightmare from which I couldn't escape. I wondered if I was dreaming, if this was all just an illusion, but it felt too real. The cold of the wind on my skin, the tingling of fear in my stomach. Then, without warning, the figure slowly turned around and walked into the darkness. I knew I shouldn't follow it, but I did anyway. Every step I took felt heavy, as if something inside me was trying to hold me back, but I couldn't resist. The figure walked further and further away, slowly but steadily, and I followed it as if forced by an invisible power. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't form a clear thought. We walked through streets that looked familiar, but on this night they seemed different, deserted, like from another world. The lamps flickered and the shadows danced around us. It felt as if I were moving into a deeper, darker reality, one beyond what I had previously known. After a while, the figure stopped. We were now in a small park, surrounded by dense trees rustling in the wind. The silence was overwhelming. I stopped a few steps behind it, unable to step closer and yet also unable to run away. Then it slowly turned around, its mask glowing in the faint light, and I could see the grotesque, distorted face more clearly now. It wasn't a simple costume, not a harmless Halloween mask. It was as if this face had come from the depths of my worst nightmares. I wanted to scream, wanted to run away, but I was paralyzed. The mask seemed alive, as if it were looking directly at me, through me, deep into my soul. Just as I thought I couldn't bear another moment, I heard it, footsteps behind me. Slowly, I turned around and there they were, the other two masked figures I had seen earlier at my door. They were now standing a few meters behind me, blocking the way back. I was surrounded. The cold air cut into my lungs, and I felt panic rising in me. They just stood there as they had all night, silent, motionless, but their mere presence screamed danger. Their sight frightened me more than anything before. I turned back to the first figure, which was still standing there, staring at me. What did they want? Why were they following me? I couldn't form a clear thought, and fear made it impossible to act logically. All I knew was that I couldn't escape. The three masked figures began to move slowly toward me, their movements stiff, almost mechanical, as if they were puppets pulled by invisible strings. My legs trembled, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. It was as if fear held me fast. Then, when they were only a few steps away from me, the first figure stopped and slowly raised its hand. The gesture was simple, but it hit me like a blow. The first figure raised its hand, pointing with a single finger directly at me. It was not a threat, but an accusation, so cold and inevitable that the blood froze in my veins. At that moment, I knew they had been watching me the whole time, that there was no coincidence. Everything that had happened, the ringing at the door, the masks, the silence, was geared toward leading me here, to this moment, to this revelation. But what did they want from me? What had I done to attract their attention? The three masked figures now stood in a tight semicircle around me, their faces, or rather their masks, staring at me incessantly. The grotesque smile on their masks now looked even more distorted, even more threatening, as if they might strike at any moment. But they did nothing, they just stood there. The tension grew with every second, and I felt as if I were about to lose control at any moment. It was as if they were playing with me, torturing me without ever actually striking. I couldn't form a clear thought anymore. All I felt was pure, immeasurable fear. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint whisper, so subtle that I wasn't sure if it was real at all. The masked figures didn't move, their masks remained fixed on me, but the whisper seemed to come from them. It was as if the darkness itself was speaking to me, forming words I couldn't understand. The whisper grew louder, swelling until it filled my head. The words were incomprehensible, distorted as if coming from another world, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to warn me. Of what, I couldn't say, but the fear became unbearable. My hands began to tremble, and I felt sweat running down my back. The masked figures still hadn't moved, but the whisper in my head became so loud that I thought I would lose my mind. It felt as if I were trapped between two realities, the world I knew and another. Much darker world that wanted to swallow me. I wanted to scream, but my voice failed me. All I could do was stand there motionless and hope that the nightmare would end soon. But deep inside me, I knew this was only the beginning. The cold suddenly became unbearable. It was as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the air and I could barely move my limbs anymore. Every breath hurt, and I felt as if my body itself was slowly freezing. The masked figures remained motionless, but their presence intensified the cold. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't move an inch anymore. It was as if the air itself had trapped me, as if I were trapped in another reality. The park, the street itself, the world around me seemed to have changed, as if I were being pulled into a deeper, darker dimension. The masked figures slowly moved closer. It wasn't a fast, aggressive step, but a slow, agonizing movement that only increased my fear. Their rigid masks seemed to mock me, and the grotesque smile on their faces looked increasingly eerie. I knew I had to do something to free myself, but my body didn't react. It was as if my mind had been disconnected from the rest of my body, as if I were just an observer of my own fate. Then the realization came. It wasn't a sudden insight, but a quiet, clear understanding that settled in my mind. These masked figures were not human. They were something else. Something that didn't belong in this world, perhaps never had. I understood that this was not a simple Halloween prank. I had been drawn into something much bigger than I could have imagined. These masked figures had chosen me. Why, I didn't know, but I was now part of their dark game. It was as if the world around me was dissolving, as if reality itself was breaking apart under their masked gazes. Everything I had considered real, everything I knew about the world, seemed meaningless. But instead of fighting, I felt a strange calm. It was as if I had accepted what was to come. The cold, the silence, the masks, they were now a part of me. The masked figures now stood so close to me that I could almost touch their masks. Their presence was overwhelming, but I felt no panic anymore. It was as if I had lost control of my own mind, as if I had surrendered to whatever they wanted from me. Slowly, they raised their hands, and each of them pointed a finger at me. The grotesque smile on their masks seemed to grow larger, as if they knew they had won. I couldn't say how long we stood there, minutes, hours, perhaps even days. Time had lost its meaning. Then suddenly they lowered their hands and turned around. They disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they had come, and I was left alone in the park amidst the icy silence. It was over, but deep inside me, I knew I would never truly be free. In the following days, everything felt different. The world around me was the same, but I felt that something inside me had broken. The masked figures had changed me, their silent gaze, the grotesque smile, the paralyzing cold, all of it was etched into my memory. I couldn't tell anyone who would believe me. It was as if I carried a secret that I couldn't share with anyone. A part of me wondered if I had lost my mind, but every time I thought about it, I heard the faint whisper in my head again, and every time night falls and the wind howls through the streets, I have the feeling that they will come back, that they will visit me again with their grotesque masks and their silent gaze, because deep inside me, I know that the masks of the night never truly disappear. It was a few days before Halloween when I received the strange package. It was in my mailbox without a sender or stamp, just a plain white envelope with my name on it. At first, I thought it was a joke, a harmless invitation to a Halloween party. But when I opened the letter, I only read a short, cryptic message. Come to the house that everyone has forgotten. October 31st, midnight. I was confused and curious at the same time. Which house were they referring to, and why had I received this invitation? There was no address given, no clue to help me find the forgotten house. Yet I felt an inexplicable pull. The thought of not knowing who sent me this message made me nervous, but also curious. I asked some friends if they had received similar invitations, but no one knew anything. They all seemed to dismiss it as a bad joke, but something about the message wouldn't let me go. It felt as if this house were real, as if it truly existed somewhere in the city and was waiting for me. The days passed and Halloween approached. I couldn't forget the invitation. It seemed to haunt me like a constant whisper in the background of my thoughts. Although I knew it was irrational, I decided to investigate the matter. On October 31st, as night fell, I set out to find the forgotten house. I didn't have an exact address, but somehow I knew where I had to go. It was as if an invisible force was guiding me through the dark streets of the city. The wind was cool and sharp, and the Halloween decorations on the houses suddenly seemed less cheerful and more eerie, as if they were watching me. I passed familiar places, but soon I found myself in a part of the city I didn't know. The streets became narrower, the houses older and more dilapidated. There were no more street lamps, and the darkness around me seemed to come alive. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the darkness itself wanted to hold me back. The path led me deeper into a neighborhood that seemed to be from another time. Old Victorian houses, dilapidated and overgrown with nature, stood next to each other. No light, no people. It was as if this place had been forgotten for a long time. I wondered how it was possible that I had never noticed this part of the city. My heart pounded faster when I saw a particular house in the distance. It was larger than the others, with high towers and broken windows, and it seemed to draw me in. I knew instinctively that this was the house meant in the invitation. I was completely alone now, and the wind howled through the deserted streets, but something inside me said I had to get closer. The house looked as if it had been uninhabited for decades. The windows were broken, the facade was overgrown with ivy, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. It was hard to say if it had ever been inhabited or if it had always been in this state, as if it had always been waiting for someone like me to discover it. I hesitated in front of the front door, unsure if I should enter. Something about this place was wrong, but I couldn't say exactly what. It was as if the house itself was watching me, as if it were alive and waiting for me. The moon shone through the clouds, and in the faint light, I could see the weathered details of the house. It was old, much older than anything I had seen before. I knew I shouldn't be here, but it was too late to turn back. The invitation had led me here, and now I stood before the door of this forgotten house. My hand trembled as I reached for the rusty doorknob. The wind seemed to fall silent for a moment, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Slowly, I opened the door. It creaked loudly, and a cold draft struck me. The inside of the house was dark, and I could barely make out anything. But it wasn't the darkness that scared me. It was the feeling that I was not alone, as if something was waiting for me in the dark. Despite the fear that seized me, I stepped over the threshold. The interior of the house was in even worse condition than I had expected. The furniture was dusty, the wallpaper torn, and cobwebs hung from the ceilings. It looked as if no one had been here for decades. But the silence was unnatural, so deep and complete that every sound I made seemed twice as loud. I couldn't help but feel that the house had been waiting for me. Every step I took made the floor creak under my feet, and the dust floating in the air seemed to move in strange patterns. It was as if time had stood still here, as if the world outside had moved on while this house was trapped in an eternal moment. I walked further into the hallway. The darkness around me grew denser, and the cold increased. Everywhere I looked, shadows seemed to lurk. It was as if they moved, but always outside my field of vision. My steps slowed, and my breath was shallow. Every room I passed was empty, but the feeling of presence grew stronger. It was as if the house itself was alive. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as if it were watching me, as if it knew my thoughts. Every breath I took seemed to echo off the walls, and I wondered if I was still alone. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from one of the rooms. The scratching sound came from upstairs. I hesitated, my heart pounding faster, and I considered simply turning around and leaving. But something held me captive. It was as if the house was calling me, luring me deeper into its dark corridors. Against my better judgment, I started to climb the old, creaking stairs. Every step groaned under my weight, and the noise got louder the higher I went. It was as if something was waiting for me in the darkness, something just waiting for me to get closer. The cold was almost unbearable now, and I could see my breath in small clouds in front of me. My hands trembled as I gripped the railing tightly. Once upstairs, the narrow hallway led me to a door at the end of the corridor. The scratching was now clearly audible, as if something on the other side of the door was trying to break free. My head was full of thoughts. Was I crazy? Had I imagined all of this? But the noise was too real to ignore. I stood in front of the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. A part of me wanted to run away, but I couldn't. It was as if I had no choice. Slowly, I turned the handle down, and the door opened with a slow, agonizing creak. What I saw behind the door made the blood freeze in my veins. The room was small and almost empty, except for an old, crumbling mirror in the corner. But that wasn't what sent me into a panic. In the middle of the room, barely visible in the moonlight, stood a figure. It was so motionless that I didn't notice it at first, but then I realized that it was staring at me. The figure was wrapped in a long, dark cloak, and its face was unrecognizable. It was too dark, and the shadow seemed to fill the entire room, but I felt the eyes watching me through the darkness. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my body froze. I wanted to scream, wanted to run away, but my body wouldn't obey me. It was as if the figure had cast a spell on me, as if I were trapped in that moment. The air in the room seemed to stand still, and time lost all meaning. I couldn't even hear my own breath. Then suddenly the figure slowly, almost deliberately, raised a hand and pointed at me. It was an ominous gesture, and at that moment I knew I had made a big mistake. I should never have entered this house. The invitation was not an invitation, it was a warning. Before I could react, I heard the scratching again, this time right behind me. In pure panic, I turned around. The scratching came from the wall behind me, as if something was lurking right inside the walls of the house. My heart pounded, and I knew I had to get out of this room, out of this house. Without thinking, I ran to the door, threw it open, and rushed down the hallway. I could still hear the noise. It followed me. A scratching sound that followed me through the entire house, as if it were pursuing me. The darkness in the corridors was even denser now, and the shadows seemed to reach for me as if they were grabbing at me. My steps were hurried, my thoughts chaotic, but I knew I had to get out of here. The stairs creaked under my feet as I rushed down them. Every breath was hard, and the cold seemed to crush me, but the noise didn't stop. It was as if the house itself was trying to hold me, to devour me. Every step became heavier, as if the floor was giving way beneath me. I reached the entrance hall and rushed to the door. My hands trembled as I tried to turn the rusty knob, but the door wouldn't move a millimeter. It was as if it were locked, as if the house wouldn't let me escape. Panic gripped me, and I desperately hit the door. Then I felt it, a coldness approaching from behind. I slowly turned around. The cold surrounding me was different from before. It wasn't just the cold of the old house. It was a cold that came from something else. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Something was behind me, something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't see, but I felt its presence. My heart pounded, and panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was trapped with no way out. The door was locked, and the darkness around me grew denser. It was as if the house itself was working against me, as if it wouldn't let me escape. I could still hear the scratching. It was getting closer, louder, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. With all my strength, I tried to pull the door open, but it remained locked. I felt the cold envelop me, as if invisible hands were reaching for me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, only the darkness surrounding me and the feeling that something was lurking in that darkness. My hands trembled, and I could barely breathe anymore. The cold penetrated every fiber of my body, and I knew I didn't have much time left. I took a step back from the door and felt my legs give way. Then, without warning, the scratching stopped. The sudden silence was even worse than the scratching. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, as if something in the darkness was waiting for the right moment. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could barely think clearly anymore. The darkness around me seemed to move. As if it were alive, I stood in the entrance hall, unable to move. Every breath was difficult, and the silence seemed to creep into my thoughts. It was as if I were alone in this huge, forgotten world, trapped in a house that should have been dead long ago. But something in this house was alive, something that was watching me. The door was still locked, and I knew I couldn't escape. The figure upstairs, the scratching in the walls, it all felt connected, as if part of a larger plan I couldn't understand. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself that I was just hallucinating, but deep inside me, I knew that what I was experiencing was real. The silence, the darkness, the cold, they were all too present to be just in my head. Then I heard it again. This time it wasn't scratching, it was a faint whisper. The whisper was barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. It came from all sides, from the walls, from the darkness, and I couldn't understand the words. They were distorted, foreign, but I felt their meaning. It was as if the house itself was speaking to me, warning me or mocking me. Every nerve in my body was tense, and I felt panic growing in me. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if it wanted to drive me insane. I tried to ignore it, but it filled my head, leaving me no clear thought. It was everywhere, and yet I couldn't see anyone. My legs trembled, and I could barely stand anymore. I knew I had to get out of this house, but the door was still locked, and the darkness around me grew denser. The whisper now sounded almost like laughter, as if the darkness itself was making fun of me. I took a step back, feeling the cold wood of the door against my back. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the whisper filled the room. My hands were shaking, and I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Then the whisper suddenly stopped, and silence returned. The sudden silence was even more oppressive. My heart pounded, and I knew something terrible was about to happen. It was as if the house was waiting for me to take the next step, but I couldn't move. My legs felt as if they were frozen in place, and the darkness around me grew denser. I couldn't breathe anymore. Then I saw it, a shadow moving in the darkness, barely visible but disturbingly real. It seemed to detach itself from the walls, as if it were formed from the darkness itself. My breath hitched, and I couldn't move. The shadow floated silently across the room towards me. Every muscle in my body was paralyzed, and I could only watch as the shadow got closer. It wasn't a human, not an animal. It was something else, something I couldn't understand. The air around me became icy, and I felt the cold penetrate my bones. I wanted to run away, but my body wouldn't react. The shadow was right in front of me now, and I felt it envelop me. It was as if I were being pulled into the darkness itself, as if the reality around me was blurring. Then I heard it again, the whisper, this time louder and clearer. The words of the whisper were now clearly audible, and I suddenly understood what they were telling me. They told of the house, of its past, of all the people who had entered it and never returned. It was not an ordinary house. It was a place of forgetting, a place that devoured the souls of those who entered it. The realization hit me like a blow. This house was alive. It wasn't a building of stone and wood. It was a being that lived off the fears and despair of those who were lured into its walls. I was just the next in a long line of victims who would never escape. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, and the words burned themselves into my mind. There was no escape. I was trapped in this house, trapped in the darkness that surrounded it. The shadow that enveloped me was only the beginning. I knew I would soon become one with the house, just like all the others before me who had entered. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my lips. The darkness was everywhere now, and the whisper was the only thing that still existed. It told me of my fate, of the endless darkness that awaited me. I knew I was lost. With my last strength, I tried to break free from the grip of the darkness. I wasn't ready to give up yet, not ready to surrender to this house. My hands gripped the door, and I pulled with all my might, but it remained locked. The darkness around me seemed to solidify, to become denser, and the whisper grew louder, more menacing. My thoughts were a blur, and I could barely think clearly anymore. All I wanted was to get out of here, back into the real world. But reality seemed to fade further and further away, as if the house itself were swallowing it. Every breath became harder, and the cold penetrated deeper into my body. I turned around, looking for another exit, but there was none. The darkness was everywhere, and the shadow that had enveloped me was now a part of me. I felt my strength fading, my thoughts growing weaker. The whisper now spoke directly to me, as if trying to soothe me. There was no escape. I was trapped. I knew I had no choice left. The house had cast its spell on me, and there was nothing I could do to escape. The darkness was everywhere, and I felt it swallowing me, as if the house itself was calling me, pulling me into its world. I felt no fear, only a strange calm, as if I had accepted my fate, as if I knew this was the only way. The whisper was now clear and distinct, and I understood what it was telling me. It was time to let go. With a final breath, I let go of the door and stepped back into the darkness. The shadow that had enveloped me was now a part of me, and I knew I would never escape. But strangely enough, I felt no pain, no fear, only a deep, endless silence. The house had won. I don't know how long I remained in the darkness. Time had lost its meaning, and the reality I once knew was just a faint memory. The house had swallowed me, just as it had swallowed all the others who had entered. I was now a part of it, part of its endless story. The whisper that had once driven me mad was now soothing, almost like a lullaby. The darkness that had once terrified me was now my home. The house had found me, and I had found it. There was no way out, but strangely enough, I no longer felt lost. I was home. As a child, I often heard the legend of the Pumpkin Man. It was one of those stories they told in our town every year on Halloween, but never really believed. The Pumpkin Man, so the story went, was a grim figure who appeared in the fields on the night of the dead, always with a glowing pumpkin as a head. Whoever encountered him would be taken by him and never return. My grandmother often told these stories when I was little. She warned me not to go out into the fields after dark, especially on Halloween night. But back then, I only considered it superstition, a scary story meant to keep children from going out at night. But as I got older, I kept hearing reports of people who claimed to have seen the Pumpkin Man. There weren't many, but those who spoke about it always described him the same way: tall, thin, with a pumpkin for a head whose eyes and mouth glowed with an eerie grin. Every time someone set foot in the fields that night, they disappeared without a trace. Some said it was just coincidence, others said it was an accident. But deep inside me, the fear of this figure grew. As this Halloween approached, I decided to follow the old myth. I wanted to find out if the Pumpkin Man really existed. I hadn't heard anything about the legend for a long time until a few weeks ago when I met old friends who still lived in our town. We talked about old times, and one of them mentioned the Pumpkin Man almost casually, as if it were an old fairy tale that reminded us all of our childhood. But when he talked about it, I saw the expression on his face, a mixture of skepticism and real fear. My curiosity was piqued. Why had these old stories persisted so stubbornly in our town? Could there really be some truth to it? So, I decided to go out to the fields this Halloween night and see for myself. I was an adult, rational, and finally wanted to prove that it was nothing more than a myth. My friends strongly advised me against it. They said it was stupid to go out into the fields at night, especially at this time of year. They reminded me of the missing people who were supposedly taken by the Pumpkin Man, but I just laughed it off. I was sure it was just coincidence. Old stories exaggerated over the years. The closer Halloween got, the more determined I became. I wanted to know the truth. The fields weren't far from the town, and I knew the way well. I had spent many nights out there, but this time everything felt different, as if the darkness itself was waiting for me. On October 31st, shortly before midnight, I set out. The fields lay still under the black sky when I arrived. The moon shone faintly through the clouds, and the wind carried the rustling of the dry leaves with it. I walked along the narrow path that ran between the cornfields. Everywhere around me, the withered stalks loomed like silent witnesses to past harvests. It was eerily quiet, no sound, no animals, not even the distant call of an owl, just the wind quietly sweeping through the cornfields. I held a flashlight in my hand, but it seemed to illuminate almost nothing, as if the darkness that night were denser than ever before. The farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. It was as if the field stretched endlessly, as if I had entered a labyrinth of stalks. The path I knew so well suddenly seemed unfamiliar. I couldn't see the edge of the fields anymore, and the moon had disappeared behind the clouds. My steps slowed, and the feeling that I was not alone grew stronger. The silence, the darkness, it was as if something was lurking around me, invisible but present. I laughed nervously. It was absurd. The Pumpkin Man was just a story, nothing more. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from deep within the fields. The noise was quiet, almost imperceptible, but in the complete silence of the night it seemed to amplify. It sounded like something being dragged across the ground, a slow, scraping noise that echoed in my ears. I stopped and held my breath, trying to locate the source of the noise, but it seemed to come from all around me. My heart rate accelerated and my hands tightened with nervousness. Was it just the wind rustling the dry stalks? But it was completely different. I directed the flashlight toward the cornfields, but the light was swallowed by the dense rows of stalks. All I saw was the dense, lifeless cornfield stretching seemingly endlessly before me. But the feeling that something was watching me wouldn't go away. I took a few more steps. The noise followed me. It was clearer now, as if something was slowly crawling through the fields. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself it was just my nerves, that there was nothing unusual, but deep inside, I knew something was wrong. Then, in the faint light of my flashlight, I saw it, a large, dark figure moving at the edge of the field. For a moment, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. The darkness could often distort shadows and make things appear that weren't there. But the figure was real, large, with a massive body, and it was moving slowly but deliberately between the corn stalks. My breath hitched, and I felt my heart pounding against my chest. The legend of the Pumpkin Man instantly flashed through my mind, and for the first time that evening, I felt real fear. It couldn't be true, it was just a story, or was it? The figure was real, and it was moving toward me. I took a step back, trying to direct the flashlight beam onto the figure, but the light suddenly flickered, as if the darkness were swallowing it. For a moment, I could see the outlines more clearly, a massive body, and to my horror, a glowing pumpkin instead of a head. The grotesque grin of the pumpkin glowed in the faint moonlight, and the eye sockets seemed to be directed right at me. It was as if the pumpkin were alive, as if the light inside it pulsed like the heart of a creature not of this world. Panic coursed through me, and I turned to run away. But before I could even take a step, I heard the figure's steps following me, slow, heavy, and relentless. My first instinct was to run. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and the Pumpkin Man was pursuing me with a slow but determined movement. I could hear his heavy steps behind me, the sound of something breaking through the dry stalks. I ran as fast as I could, but it felt as if I were in a nightmare. My legs weren't fast enough. Every step seemed to get heavier, and the path I knew seemed to dissolve in the darkness. There was no way out, only endless rows of cornfields surrounding me. The noise behind me grew louder, closer. The Pumpkin Man was right on my heels, and I could feel the glowing shine of his head on my neck. Fear overwhelmed me, and I stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the ground. The flashlight rolled out of my hand and went out. I lay there, breathing heavily in my chest, while the sound of the steps grew closer. There was no doubt he was right behind me now. I wanted to get up, wanted to keep running, but my body was paralyzed with fear. I could only lie there and hear the steps getting closer and closer. Then in the deep darkness, I saw it again, the grinning face of the pumpkin staring directly at me. Fear completely paralyzed me as the steps came to a halt right next to me. I could feel the breath of the pumpkin man, even though I knew he had no mouth, at least none I could explain. But the glowing light from his eye sockets and grinning mouth illuminated the ground around me in a faint orange shimmer. I tried to move, but my legs felt as if they were rooted to the ground. My hands clawed at the dry earth as if I could hold on to it, but it was useless. Slowly, I raised my head, and there he was, right above me, the pumpkin man. His body was tall and thin, almost like the skeleton of a man, wrapped in a long, torn coat. But it was his head, the glowing pumpkin, that filled me with terror. The grotesque smile carved into the pumpkin's face seemed alive, and the eye sockets glowed with an intense, eerie light. Slowly, he bent down toward me, and I felt the pressure of his bony hand on my shoulder. It was cold, ice cold, and the grip tightened as if he wanted to hold me fast. I screamed in my head, but no sound came from my lips. It was as if I had lost the ability to speak. I knew I had to break free before it was too late. In a final, desperate attempt to free myself, I wrenched myself out of the pumpkin man's grip. It was as if I broke through an invisible barrier, and suddenly I could move again. Adrenaline flooded my body, and I pushed myself off the ground, running blindly into the darkness without knowing where I was going. The cornfield seemed endless, and I could still see the glow of the pumpkin behind me. It was like a lighthouse of horror, relentlessly pursuing me. The pumpkin man's steps were heavy and slow, but they seemed to be getting closer no matter how fast I ran. I was gasping for breath, and my legs felt like they were giving way under me, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, he would get me. I knew that now with terrifying clarity. I didn't know what had happened to the people who had disappeared before me, but I had a feeling I would soon find out if I didn't escape. Suddenly, I bumped into something hard, a fence, the edge of the field. I was almost out. With trembling hands, I climbed over the fence, fell hard onto the ground on the other side, but I had made it. I was out of the cornfield. But as I turned around, I saw it again, the glowing face of the pumpkin man staring at me through the rows of fields. After I got over the fence, I expected the pumpkin man to follow me further, but as I stared at him, he stopped at the edge of the cornfield, motionless, and the glow of his head seemed to dim. For a moment, I thought he might not follow me any further. Perhaps he wasn't allowed to leave the field. The sudden silence was eerie. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just the heavy, oppressive silence of the night. My breath was shallow, and my heart pounded heavily in my chest as I tried to grasp what had just happened. The pumpkin man was still standing there, not moving, but I knew he was watching me. I gathered all my courage and took a step back, away from the field. Nothing happened. Another step. The pumpkin man remained in place, as if he couldn't follow me any further. A part of me wanted to run away as fast as possible, but I was paralyzed by fear and the fascination emanating from that eerie figure. It was as if he had brought me to the edge of reality, to a place where the normal rules no longer applied. But why didn't he follow me? What held him back? The questions hammered in my head, but I knew I wouldn't find any answers as long as I stood there. I moved away from that cursed place before it was too late. With shaky legs, I started the walk back to the town. Every step felt heavy, as if exhaustion and fear were weighing me down. The way I had come suddenly seemed much longer, and the darkness seemed to follow me every step of the way. But the pumpkin man stayed behind in the field as if he were bound to that place. When I saw the lights of the town in the distance, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it, I had escaped. But deep inside me, I knew that this encounter had changed me forever. The legend of the pumpkin man was real, and I had looked it in the face. But why did he spare me? When I reached the first houses, I noticed how quiet the town was. No children on the streets, no Halloween festivities. It was as if the town itself had fallen into a deep sleep. The street lamps cast only weak, flickering lights, and the windows of the houses were dark. It felt as if I had returned to another world. I walked faster, just wanting to get home, to the safety of my house. But as I arrived at my front door, I felt that strange feeling again, as if something were watching me. I turned around, looked into the darkness of the street, but there was nothing there. Was it just my imagination, or had the pumpkin man found a way to follow me? In the days following my return, I tried to suppress the events. It was hard to believe what I had seen. Anyone I told would think I was crazy. So I kept quiet and went on with my life as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, the memory of that night gnawed at me, the gaze of the pumpkin man, the eerie glow of his pumpkin head. The town seemed the same as ever, as if nothing had happened. People went about their daily lives, and no one spoke of the scare or the pumpkin man. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I drove past the cornfield, I felt my stomach clench. The fields looked the same as always, harmless and quiet, but I knew what was lurking there. The nights became more difficult. I often woke up in a sweat after having nightmares of glowing pumpkin heads and tall, thin figures chasing me. The pumpkin man wouldn't let me go, not even in my dreams. It was as if he had marked me, as if I now belonged to him. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, that slow, heavy scratching that reminded me of the footsteps in the cornfield. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible that he had followed me here, or had he? I slowly turned and listened. The scratching grew louder, as if something or someone were moving right in front of my door. It sounded just like the noise in the fields when the pumpkin man had followed me. My heart began to race, and I couldn't suppress the trembling in my hands. I had hoped it was over, that I had escaped him, but now he was here near me, and there was nothing I could do about it. Slowly, I crept out of my bed, my heart pounding in my ears, and went to my bedroom door. I pressed my ear against it and listened, but the scratching seemed to come from the other side. It was as if he were standing in front of my door, waiting for the right moment to come in. I didn't know what to do. Panic overwhelmed me, and my thoughts raced. Had I really believed I could escape the pumpkin man? Had I really believed he wouldn't find me? Now that he was here, I knew I had no chance. I took a step back, pressing my back against the wall as if I could hide, but the scratching didn't stop. It got louder, more insistent, as if the pumpkin man wanted to remind me that there was no escape. I had to face the truth. He had found me, and he wouldn't stop until he got me. Then the scratching suddenly stopped. The sudden silence made me even more nervous. The scratching that had put me in a panic was gone, but the fear remained. The darkness around me seemed to grow denser, and I couldn't shake the thought that the pumpkin man was right in front of my door, still and patiently waiting. I knew I couldn't just stand there, but every move felt wrong, as if I were attracting the pumpkin man closer to me with it. The air in the room seemed to get colder, and my breath grew shallow. Fear choked my throat, and I could barely think clearly. I had the feeling that time had stopped, that every moment was dragging on. The darkness was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the thought that he was watching me. I wondered how long I could stand there before panic finally overwhelmed me. Then, without warning, I heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it didn't come from the door. It came from the walls, from everywhere around me. It was as if the pumpkin man had broken into reality itself, as if he were surrounding me without me being able to see him. Panic seized me, and I knew I had to act. In a final, desperate attempt to free myself, I rushed to the door and threw it open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, and the darkness seemed to close in on me even more deeply. The scratching was still there, but I couldn't make out its source. It was as if it were echoing right inside my head, as if the pumpkin man were chasing me from the inside. I ran through the house, my steps echoing through the silent rooms, but no matter where I went, the scratching followed me. It got louder, more threatening, as if it were pursuing me, as if the pumpkin man were lurking in every corner. My heart pounded and my thoughts were a jumble. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. Finally, I reached the front door and threw it open. The cold night air hit my face, and for a moment I thought I had escaped. But as I stepped out into the darkness, I saw it again, the eerie glow of the pumpkin staring at me through the night. He was here. The pumpkin man had found me, and there was no way out anymore. I couldn't escape. The steps became audible again, slow and heavy, and I felt fear overwhelm me. The pumpkin man had come to get me. The pumpkin man stood right in front of me now, the grinning face of his pumpkin head glowing in the darkness. I couldn't run away, couldn't scream. It was as if time had stopped and reality around me shattered. The pumpkin man slowly raised his hand and pointed at me as if warning me one last time. I knew this was the end. There was no escape. He was here and I was his next victim. The legend had turned out to be true, and I had been foolish enough to try to get to the bottom of it. Now, in the darkness, I knew that the pumpkin man never stopped hunting. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he bent down toward me. The light of his pumpkin head blinded me, and I could only see the grotesque grin that drove me to madness. Then he placed his bony hand on my shoulder, and the darkness engulfed me for good. The hunt was over. The pumpkin man had won. It was on the night before Halloween that I first saw the girl. I was on my way home after working overtime. The streets were empty, only the weak lights of the street lamps illuminating the otherwise dark surroundings. It was that time of year when the nights grew longer and the air colder. Everything seemed a little unsettling. I noticed her when I took the shortcut through the old park. She stood all alone right next to one of the trees, a small girl holding an old, flickering lantern in her hand. She was wearing a simple dress that looked like it was from another time. Her hair was long and black, and her face was hidden in the shadow of her hood. My first thought was that she must be lost. Who lets a child wander around alone in a park at this hour? I stopped and looked at her, but she didn't move. She held the lantern in front of her, and the flickering light made her face disappear into the shadow. I felt uncomfortable, but I couldn't quite say why. Something about her didn't seem right, but I couldn't say exactly what. Still, I decided to approach her. When I got about 3 meters close to her, she slightly raised the lantern and slowly turned around without a word. She disappeared into the darkness of the park, and I stood there, confused and with a queasy feeling. The encounter with the girl didn't leave me alone. When I finally got home, I felt restless. The scene replayed in my mind again and again. The flickering light of the lantern, the quiet rustling of the leaves under her feet, the way she looked at me without saying a single word. Something about it wasn't normal. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she was just a child dressed up for Halloween or someone playing a prank. But deep inside, I knew that wasn't it. It was her silence that haunted me. The way she had looked at me without speaking a single word. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of the girl before me, the lantern flickering faintly and her face hidden in the shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had overlooked something, that something about this encounter had opened a door deep inside me that I would have preferred to keep closed. In the middle of the night, I woke up. It was the sound of footsteps, quiet but distinct, coming from outside. I sat up and listened. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, but there it was again, the quiet rustling of footsteps on the sidewalk in front of my window. When I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing, only the silence of the night and the darkness that settled around the house like an impenetrable cloth. The next evening, I decided to walk through the park again. Something inside me said I would see the girl one more time. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling me back, as if I hadn't finished the story of this encounter. The day passed quickly, and soon the cold, dark night lay over the city again. When I entered the park, the silence was almost tangible. The wind barely stirred, and the trees cast long, distorted shadows on the path. I walked slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen the girl the night before. The tension in my chest grew with every step, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And then I saw her again. She was standing in exactly the same spot as before, the lantern in her hand. This time her face was a little easier to see, but it was still hidden by shadows. She stood still, motionless, and stared at me again. The light of the lantern was weak, as if it could go out at any moment. Again I spoke to her, and again I received no answer. But this time, something was different. It was as if she was expecting me, as if she had been waiting for this moment. The air around us grew colder, and I felt my stomach clench. Without a word, she turned around again and slowly began to walk deeper into the park. I knew I shouldn't follow her, but my legs moved almost on their own. I had to know where she was going. The girl walked with slow, even steps while I followed her. The faint light of her lantern was the only landmark guiding me through the park. The trees seemed to lean over us, their branches looking like bony fingers reaching for me. The rustling of the leaves under our feet was the only sound in the eerie silence. I wanted to say something, to ask her where she was going, but the words caught in my throat. It was as if the park itself was silencing me, as if my voice was suffocated in the darkness. The path we were taking was unfamiliar to me. I had been in this park many times, but now it seemed changed. As if we had entered another world. The girl never looked back. She kept walking, the lantern held tight in her hand while the light flickered restlessly. Sometimes it seemed as if it would go out, but then it would flare up again, only to become weaker. The deeper we went into the park, the more I felt that something was wrong. The air became colder, heavier, and the feeling of being watched increased. Suddenly, the girl stopped. We were now in a part of the park I didn't know. The trees were denser, and the light from the lantern barely seemed to penetrate the darkness anymore. For a moment, everything was silent until the girl slowly turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were empty, black and deep like holes leading into the darkness. The cold radiating from her eyes froze me. It was as if all the warmth had been sucked out of my body, as if I were staring into an endless abyss. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare back into those empty black eyes that threatened to swallow me. The silence around us became almost deafening. No wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing, just the quiet, irregular flickering of the lantern, which seemed to be getting weaker with every moment. I wanted to run away, to get away from this eerie figure, but my body was paralyzed. Then, as suddenly as the silence had come, I heard it. A sound, a quiet, almost imperceptible giggle that seemed to come from deep within the darkness. It was the laugh of a child, but it was distorted, unnatural. It made the blood freeze in my veins. The girl didn't move. She still stood there motionless while the laughter grew louder, as if the darkness itself was laughing at me. My heart pounded, and I felt panic rising in me. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I took a step back, the lantern suddenly went out, and I was plunged into complete darkness. The darkness was so dense that I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my eyes. My heart was beating wildly, and my breath was shallow as I tried to sense my surroundings, but there was nothing, no light, no sound, no movement. I was alone in the dark, and the girl had disappeared. Panic seized me, and I spun around, desperately searching for an exit, but every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness. There was no way back. The silence was oppressive, and I felt as if the darkness itself was closing in on me, as if it were sucking me in. Then I heard it again, the quiet giggle that came from the darkness. It was closer, much closer than before, and it made my blood run cold. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy as if they were stuck in the ground. The giggle grew louder, more menacing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was moving around me, circling me. I called for help, but my voice faded into the darkness, as if the air around me were swallowing the sound. There was no answer, only the eerie laughter that now seemed to be right next to me. I felt a cold breath on my skin, and for a moment I thought something or someone was standing right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing, only the darkness stretching endlessly. In the darkness, time seemed to stand still. I had no idea how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Every breath felt heavy, and my legs felt like lead. The darkness around me pressed in on me, and the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. It was as if invisible eyes were staring at me from the darkness. I gathered all my courage and took a step forward. The ground crunched under my feet, and the sound echoed through the silence. It was the first sound I had heard since the lantern went out, and it made my heart beat faster. I took another step, then another. Slowly, I began to feel my way through the darkness, my hands reaching out, but I couldn't feel anything. It was as if the park itself had disappeared, as if I had stepped into a void where nothing existed. But the feeling that something or someone was following me wouldn't go away. Then, without warning, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. The sudden grip of the cold hand on my shoulder made me jump. It wasn't a gentle touch, but a firm, cold clamp, as if something or someone wanted to hold me fast. My breath hitched, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. Panic seized me, but I couldn't move. I tried to shake the hand off, but the grip wouldn't let go. The pressure on my shoulder increased, and the cold penetrated my clothes, making my skin burn under the grip. I slowly turned around, my hands trembling as I tried to see the source of this touch, but the darkness was still impenetrable. There was no one there, only the darkness surrounding me and the cold spreading through my body. The giggling had stopped, but the silence it left behind was even more unsettling. I tried to pull myself away, but the grip wouldn't let go. It was as if something from the darkness didn't want to let me escape. My thoughts raced, and I knew I had to act before fear completely overwhelmed me. I took a deep breath and pulled away with all my strength. I stumbled forward, fell hard onto the ground, but the grip was gone. For a moment, I was free, but the darkness around me still felt alive, as if it were watching me. As I lay on the ground trying to orient myself, I suddenly noticed a faint light in the distance. It was small, flickering like a candle or a lantern. My heart skipped a beat. Had the girl found me again, or was it something else luring me into the darkness? I hesitated. But the light was the only thing I could cling to in this endless void. Slowly, I stood up, my legs trembling under me, and walked cautiously toward the light. With every step I took, it got a little brighter, but it was still far away. The ground crunched softly under my feet, and I could feel a slight breeze of cold air on my skin. The light was strangely comforting, even though I knew I shouldn't trust it. It was as if it were calling me, leading me deeper into the darkness. I tried to remember the way I had come, but everything seemed to have changed. The park I knew no longer existed, only the darkness and the inexplicable light pulling me forward. As I got closer, I realized it was indeed a lantern. It hung in the air without anyone holding it, and the flickering light was reflected in the darkness. I held my breath. The girl was nowhere to be seen, but the lantern shone as if it were there just for me. The lantern hung motionless in the air, and the flickering light made the shadows around it dance. I stood right in front of it, too close to turn back, but too afraid to go further. The light was weak, but it was enough to illuminate the ground under my feet and a small part of the trees around me, but there was no indication of who had placed the lantern there or why it was there. I wanted to touch the lantern, but something held me back. It was an instinctive feeling that this was not right, that this lantern was more than just a light. It was the center of the darkness, the key to everything happening here. The flickering light attracted me, but it also repelled me. It was as if it were warning me and luring me at the same time. Suddenly, I heard it again, the giggle, this time louder, closer, and it echoed through the darkness. It came from all sides, as if the darkness itself was laughing. The lantern flickered more strongly, as if the light threatened to go out at any moment. And I felt panic rising in me. I knew I had to leave, but the lantern wouldn't let me go. Its light was the only thing protecting me from the complete darkness, but it simultaneously felt like a trap. I took a step back, my gaze still fixed on the flickering light, and then the lantern suddenly went out, and I was enveloped in total darkness. The sudden darkness was oppressive. It was as if the entire world around me had disappeared, as if nothing else existed but the void. My heart was racing, and I could barely control my breathing. The silence was absolute, and the giggling had stopped. It was as if the darkness itself had spoken the last word. I felt helpless, lost in this impenetrable gloom. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness, and I had no idea where I was. The park, the girl, the lantern, everything seemed like a distant dream, something that wasn't real. But the fear was real, I knew that. Suddenly, I felt something behind me again. It was the same cold feeling as before, the same eerie pressure weighing on me. I slowly turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, but I could see nothing. The darkness was too dense, too impenetrable, but I knew something was there. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I knew I couldn't just stand there, but the darkness felt alive, as if it were enveloping me, watching me. Every step I took felt heavy, as if the air itself was working against me. Then I heard it again, the giggle, this time right behind me. The giggle was so close now that it felt like someone was whispering right into my ear. It was not a laugh that suggested joy. It was cold, cruel, and it cut through my bones. My whole body tensed, and I couldn't help but turn around again, but there was no one there, only the feeling that something or someone was lurking in the darkness, ready to strike. My breath was shallow, and I couldn't suppress the trembling in my hands. The darkness seemed to grow denser, and the feeling of an invisible presence surrounding me increased. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, that eerie presence that was watching me, following me. I shouted into the darkness, but my voice sounded weak and powerless. There was no answer, only the quiet giggle that now echoed through the night like an echo, as if it were mocking me, as if the darkness itself were playing with me. Every step I took led me deeper into the gloom, and I knew I wouldn't find a way out. Suddenly, I felt the cold breath on my skin again, and I knew I was no longer alone. Something or someone was with me now, right behind me. The giggling stopped and silence returned. I knew I had to turn around, but fear paralyzed me. The cold on my skin was unbearable. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My legs felt as if they were frozen in place, and my breath was shallow. The darkness around me was absolute, and the feeling that something was near wouldn't let me go. Slowly, very slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and I felt panic rising in me. But when I had completely turned around, there was nothing there, only the endless darkness that surrounded me. I stood there alone, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I knew I had to keep moving, that I had to find a way out, but every step felt heavier, as if the darkness itself was holding me back, as if it were preventing me from moving forward. Every breath was a struggle, and my thoughts were a jumble. Then I saw it, right in front of me, barely visible in the darkness, the girl with the lantern again. But this time the lantern wasn't glowing. She was just holding it in her hand, while her face was still hidden in the shadow. She stood there motionless, staring at me with her empty black eyes. I knew I should run away, but I couldn't move. The girl stood right in front of me, and her empty eyes seemed to pierce me. I wanted to run away, but my legs failed me. It was as if the darkness itself was holding me fast, as if there was no escape. The cold around me became unbearable, and panic threatened to overwhelm me. The giggling returned, but this time it was different. It was louder, more menacing, and it seemed to come from the depths of the darkness. The girl didn't move, but it was as if her mere presence intensified the darkness. Her eyes seemed to fixate on me, as if she wouldn't let me go anymore. I knew this was the end. There was no way out. The girl and the darkness had trapped me in their snare, and I was powerless to escape them. The giggling grew louder, and the darkness pressed heavily upon me. My legs gave way and I fell to my knees. Unable to move, the lantern in the girl's hand flickered briefly, as if it wanted to light up again for a moment, but then it went out completely and I was plunged back into total darkness. The giggling stopped and silence returned. I knew I was lost. The darkness enveloped me completely. The girl had disappeared and the lantern, which had once been the only light in the darkness, no longer shone. I knew there was no escape. The darkness had swallowed me, and I was now a part of it. The cold was no longer just around me. It was inside me. I felt it gnawing into my bones, slowly freezing me. My thoughts grew heavier, and I could feel the darkness within me as if I myself were becoming a part of it. The giggling had stopped, but I knew it was still there, somewhere in the depths of the darkness. The girl with the lantern was only a harbinger, a warning I had ignored. Now it was too late, and all I could do was wait for what would come next. The darkness was everything now. No light, no sound, no hope. I was alone, trapped in a world beyond reality. The darkness had taken me, and I would never escape. I closed my eyes, but it made no difference. The darkness was within me,